Did you guys have a chance to review this? And you all know what I mean by this. Like the this labs? Were there labs about this?
Sounds like one we
Okay. So this is one of the wonders of JavaScript. It's exciting, but it's so confusing. And I still struggle with it sometimes. So we're gonna go over some of the complexities of this today, and you might get confused. In fact, you will undoubtedly get confused during parts of this lecture. And that's okay. We're gonna go over some objectives that I want you guys to take away. And when you get confused, just remind yourself of the objectives. And if you can take away these things from the lecture, you'll be okay. So one of our takeaways is we're going to answer Dan Abramov's question. Dan Abramov is the founder of Redux, which you'll be learning about later in like Mod 4 and 5. So he knows JavaScript. He asked a question about JavaScript that related to this. So we'll look at that. Another thing we're going to talk about is understanding when the this context gets determined. We're also going to go over the 4 really important rules for understanding the this context. And that's probably the most important thing of this lecture. If you understand and remember the 4 rules of this, and they're all actually very simple rules, if you can just go back to the rules every time you get confused about the this context, you'll be okay. And then the last thing is how arrow functions come into play around the this keyword. So those are going to be our takeaways. We're going to come back to these at the end of the lecture and see if you can answer them. And if I forget to do that, remind me. So we're going to come back to this. But first I want to ask you, what is this? What's weird about it? And we're going to take some notes. So who can tell me, what is this? Ruby? Kind of like self. Hey. Yeah. So we learned something similar in Ruby, eh? Gavin.
It references an object.
Okay, so that's one of the things it can reference. Oh no. Why is this happening? Does it reference a specific object? What kind of object can it reference? Kat?
It can reference the window if it's used in a global scope, or it references the function.
Okay. So it can reference the window object. Can reference a function, or maybe a specific object. Usually a specific object. And so what's so weird about this?
When you start nesting this into other functions.
Okay, so nested this is weird. Candy? Kat? Steven? You guys gotta wake up a little. I know you're gonna get hungry as it gets closer to lunch. So I would say the main and weirdest thing about this is that it can change its context. So the biggest thing, this changes context. And when does like the this get set? Like when is the this determined of a function? Is it when I define a function?
When you call it on the object.
Exactly. So that's another important thing.
What do you mean by that?
So the this is called, or like the this is set when you're executing a function, not when you're defining a function. So it doesn't matter how or where I define a function. The only thing that matters is how I'm using that function. So definitely write some of these things down. Only thing that matters is how I use the function. All right, any other weird things about this? Okay, I think we're ready to move on and start messing around with this. So keep these things in your mind as we actually like dig into the complexities of it. So let's start with like a very simple thing. What happens if I just type this? What is it going to give me? What should I see in my Chrome console if I type this? There's the answer. It keeps telling you the answer before you even hit it. All right. So it's the window object. That's this like big global environment that the this keyword comes in. What about in Node? Because this is in my browser. Will it look the same if I do it in Node? What do you guys think I should see? Exactly. So it's a bunch of terminal stuff, right? So it's also this big global this object. But I'm no longer in the browser. I'm just in my terminal. So it tells me about like processes. It tells me I'm in Node. So this is this. All right. So that's just when we look at this in one of our environments. What about when we actually start using it inside of functions? So let me give you guys an example. I'm going to write a function. It's going to be called whothis. It's going to have a little joke in it. Knock, knock. Who's there? Who do you think is there, guys?
This.
Yes, this. So when I execute this function, now this is inside of a function. What should I see?
Node? Where are you executing?
I'll execute it in the browser. Yes, so candy.
Thank you.
Very nice. So there's a few rules surrounding this. And this is like the first major rule. When you just execute a function freely, like I'm not invoking it on any particular object, I'm just executing a function, it's referring to the global environment. So if you check out this README later today, this talks about the 4 different rules. And I learned this one as the default binding rule. So you're just invoking a function, you're not invoking it on any particular object. The this is defaultly bound to just the window object, similar to when you just call this by itself. The only thing that can be a little bit tricky is there's something called strict mode in JavaScript. I don't know if you guys have ever encountered it or used it. You probably haven't, but maybe you'll see other developers using it. So I believe strict mode was like developed so that you make fewer mistakes as you code, and Nikki can correct me if I'm wrong. So it like catches more things for you and doesn't let you get away with silent errors. And this is different in strict mode because I assume that most of the time you don't want your this to refer to the global object, like ever. You usually want it to refer to a specific thing. So when you're using strict mode, this is actually going to be undefined. And the way to use strict mode is all you do is when you're inside a function, you just type use strict. So now when I invoke whothis, what should this be? All right, cool. You guys are paying attention. Yeah, so it's undefined. So that's just a small side note. And that is our default binding rule. This within a function that's invoked freely, so not on any particular object, will always be the global this, whether it's in your browser or in your Node environment. So remember this rule. This is one of the key takeaways. All right. What happens when we actually start invoking this on objects. So now I'm going to make a little object. We're going to give it a name. What should we name our little object? JavaScript boy? Alright, so that's our little object. His name is JavaScript boy. Alright, he has, is it a he? Yeah, it's a he, it's a boy. He has his own whothis property, right? So let's give him this one, the same one. So now I can invoke whothis on this little object, JavaScript boy. And what should I see when I run this code? Any guesses? Who says global this? Who says object? All right. It's the object. So that's our second rule of this. When you invoke this on a particular object, so I'm no longer just freely invoking this function, I'm invoking it on a particular object. The this that's inside of that function is going to refer to that object. So remember the second rule. I call this the implicit binding rule. So it's implicitly bound to that object. So it's like saying, all right, you're invoking a method on this object. That means you want the this to be that object. All right. What happens if I don't make this function here? What if I just give it this function? Is it going to be the same or different? You say the same, Andy. Why?
It only cares about execution, where the execution.
Exactly. So here, it doesn't matter how this object acquired this function. Sure, it came from out here. It's still the same function. The only thing that matters is how you're invoking that function. So because I'm invoking it on this particular object, the this is still that particular object. Is everyone okay with this? Okay. So now, maybe we have enough information to answer Dan Abramov's question. Dan Abramov's question is this. I want you guys to take a little time to think about this. Anyone have any idea about how these two code snippets are different? It has to do with the topic of this lecture. Hugo? All right, what is this here?
You're invoking a method on an object?
Okay, so what is the this context going to be? Rule number 2. Yes, it's going to be that object. Candy? Sorry. What about in this example? It's slightly different from what we've done. But does anyone have any guesses? Like, think about how we're invoking it. Kat?
Is a window,
Why?
because it's not being called on an object.
Exactly. So what's happening here is, say we don't have this thing. Say we go back to what we had. This doesn't exist anymore. We're making a variable here called whothis. And we're setting it to object.whothis. So now we're just making this global variable that points to the same reference as this function. It doesn't matter that this function was initially defined inside of this object. The point is that now this is out here, and we're just invoking who this, and it's this function. And when we invoke who this outside of the object, and we're not invoking it on any particular thing, what rule is that?
First one.
Exactly, it's the first rule. So now it's just going back to the global this. Let's test this out. Any questions about that?
Can you say that again?
Which part?
The
The whole thing?
The last.
Okay, so here, you see how we're invoking who this and it's not invoked on any particular object? We're using a function that came out of this object. We brought this function out here, right? It's the same function, but now we're not invoking this function on any particular object. It's almost as if we just took this function and we copy and pasted it over here. Right? It's like having it out here again. So now we're not invoking it on anything. So the point is, it doesn't matter where functions come from. The only thing that matters is how you invoke them. So like, if we go back to this example, say we don't have a who this inside of this object, but we give this object a who this. How do we do that? How do we give this object the property who this? I want to give this object a key. How do I do that?
Say that again.
I want to give this object a new key value pair. How do I do that? Mm-hmm. Yes. I'm giving it who this. Exactly. And I want to set it to this thing. So the point is, it doesn't matter how this object comes to acquire this function. The only thing that matters is how I then invoke that function. So if I invoke who this on the object, what should it be? The object, exactly. If I invoke who this, because I have this global function who this, I don't invoke it on any object, what should it be? What will this be? The window object. All right. Exactly. Any questions about this very confusing thing? You just got to go back to the rules.
So what happens if you don't give it the key value to the object?
If I don't do this,
Yeah.
then it's going to say, well, there's no such property, who this, on this object, right? Let's find out. See, it's saying there's no such function on this object. So that's why I have to assign it. Okay. Let's do some different things.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to make some new objects. We're going to make a Nikki object. Oops. Nikki has a name. Nikki is an instructor. Nikki has a hobby. Nikki, what's your hobby?
Swimming with sharks.
Great. Oh my goodness, my spelling is off today.
It's Monday.
Okay. Say Nikki has a get hobby method. And it's going to return a string that says, hello, I'm... What should this be if I want Nikki's name?
You want one?
If I want Nikki's name.
This stuff.
Good. And my hobby is, what should this be? All right. What should this give me? All right. It's not happy about this thing. It's not happy about this experiment we did. All right. So this is behaving as expected, right? Say I have an object called Matt. His hobby is selling meat, of course. Gavin knows me well. All right. What if I do this? What if I try to give Matt this same property, get hobby? I want Matt to have a get hobby method. Can I do this? I can do this. Of course I can do this. What will this get me when I invoke this?
Will it get you the same thing that it did before?
You gotta be a little bit more specific. Is this gonna be Matt or Nikki? It's gonna be Nikki? Who says Nikki? Raise your hands. All right. Who says Matt? Raise your hands. All right. Reasoning. Reasons why. I want to hear reasons from both sides.
Because you're just setting get hobby to that function, that specific function, and it's being called from the context of the object from that.
I like what I'm hearing.
Oh wow, that is a great explanation.
That is a very great explanation. So, same idea. It doesn't matter how Matt happened to get this function inside of his object. The only thing that matters is that I'm now invoking it on Matt. So it just depends on how I'm invoking the function. But I want you guys to notice something very important. In all of these examples, I've been passing a reference to the function. I haven't been passing around an invoked function. What would happen if instead of this, I do this? It's a very important difference.
It would work. Oh, you're setting it to the string.
Jordan? Very nice. So now I'm setting a property called getHobby on Matt. That's the value of this thing invoked. And what's this thing invoked? It's this. So now this thing gets called on Nikki. We get this string. So now this isn't even, it's not even a function that can be invoked, it's just a property. So that's something very important to notice. Or like going back to this example that we had with the who this inside of our object. Like what would happen if I set it to this? To the invoked version of who this. Any guesses? Why?
Because it's referring back to the function.
Exactly, and this isn't being called on anything. So maybe an easier way to envision this is like setting it on the outside. I'm setting a property on this object called who this that's set to the invoked version of this function. And what happens when I invoke this function? What happens? I get the window, right? So now this has the window. All right. So we understand two rules now of this. The third rule is the explicit binding rule. So there's actually a way to explicitly tell a function what you want this to be in that function. And you can do that by using call, apply, or bind. Does anyone have familiarity with those? Gavin?
Some.
Okay. That's fair. I don't know that if that was a fishing for candy kind of answer or not.
It was not. I maxed out on candy.
Okay, cool. So, let's say we have a new function that's called on the weekend. And it's supposed to work with these objects and return what that person does on the weekend. So it's like, hi, what should this be? Where do you think I'm going with this? There's a name, exactly. And on the weekend, I enjoy, what should this be? Yeah, and this function, it can have arguments. Why not? Let's put some friends in. I enjoy some hobby with, what should this be? Friend one or this dot friend? Friend one, because these objects don't have friend one as a property on them. So we're just pulling this in from the argument. Sure, why not? And not friend two, okay. Okay. There's a way that I can invoke this function on a particular object. Does anyone know how to do that? Cat? Sorry.
I mean, do you want to?
No, it's
Okay. So you would do on the weekend call.
What does call take as its arguments?
It takes the objects that you want to call that on, and then the arguments for the function afterwards.
Exactly. So the first argument is what you want this to refer to inside of that function. Because we see this function, this very friendly function, it has this inside of it. So when we use .call, we're explicitly, that's why it's the explicit binding rule, we're explicitly telling this function, hey you, I want your this to be Nikki. And then any further arguments with .call after you specify the this are just the arguments that the function itself takes. So if this function doesn't take any arguments, you would just leave this blank. Otherwise, you can do things like this. So what should this say when I invoke this function? What should I get back?
Hi, I'm Nikki, and on the weekend, I enjoy swimming with sharks with friends and all that.
I just want to see that written in text, so I'm going to run it. All right. What about apply? How does apply work?
It works the exact same except the arguments that you pass in for the function are as an array.
Exactly. So it works exactly the same as call. But first argument is still what you want this to be. Second argument is actually an array of all of the arguments that that function takes. So this should give us the same thing. Shall we see it again? All right. .bind works a little bit differently. It still allows you to explicitly state what you want the this to be in a given context, but it works a little bit differently. So,
You
Hugo.
said dot apply is just an array, right? That's
Mhm.
the only difference?
So say I had a function called mat time, and I wanted to, for this function to tell me what mat does. He doesn't have a get hobby method, or he doesn't have an on the weekend function. What should I do here to bind? Can I do this?
Yep.
Okay, so then the difference with dot bind versus call and apply. With call and apply, these functions are invoked right away. With dot bind, you're saving a reference to a particular function and you're defining what the this should be when you call that function later. So if I were to call mat time later, I can give him some friends who are Matt's friends.
Jane.
All right. Who's not his friend? What should I see when I invoke this? What should I see?
Hey, I'm Matt.
I did define it. Hmm? It should work. I'm not seeing the error here. Does anyone know? Nikki, do you know? Maybe I didn't say that? Maybe I didn't refresh. There we go. Yeah, so this should work. Don't want to confuse you guys. All right. What if I give Nikki a property? This gets interesting. What if I invoke Nikki.funtime? Am I gonna get Matt or am I gonna get Nikki?
I'll give you that,
Why?
because you explicitly stated that this should be that.
Exactly. So I've already bound this here. So now mat time refers to a bound version of on the weekend that will always refer to Matt. So even when I try to give Nikki her own property, that's that same reference to that same function, this will still give me Matt. I enjoy selling meat with Jane and not Matt. That's kind of strange. All right. Let's go back to our old example here. I want to give Matt his own get hobby method. We did that here, right? When we invoke this, what should we get? We did this earlier. So Nikki has a get hobby function. I give Matt his own getHobby function that I steal from Nikki. When I invoke this, what should it be? Which rule? Implicit, right? So therefore it should be who? Matt or Nikki? Okay, cool. There's a way that I can bind this. To just Nikki. So now when I invoke this, what will I get? All right, so that is the explicit binding rule. You have call, apply, and bind. All very handy options for different situations. Okay. Any questions so far? All right, let's go into our last rule. Our last rule might not make a lot of sense right now. It has to do with constructor functions in JavaScript, which is the whole topic of object-oriented JavaScript, which we're not gonna go over in this lecture, but Nikki will be covering it later. But it's kind of a way to make classes in JavaScript. Kind of like in Ruby. Remember you had classes, def-initialized. Does that make any sense to you at this point, or did you already forget? So you had classes, you had your def-initialize method, and self referred to specific instance, right? So JavaScript has something like that as well. We call them constructor functions because JavaScript doesn't have true classes. So if you wanted to create a class in JavaScript, you would do something like, you'd make a function with a capital, like say I wanted to make a class for instructors. And that just signifies that you're gonna try to use it as a class. And then in here, kind of like Ruby, you do your self dot all of these properties, but instead we have this dot name.
So how does it know to refer this as to the function instructor?
Yeah, so Nikki will go over this a little bit later today, but the way it knows is the way that you invoke it. So it always goes back to how you're executing the function, how you're invoking it. And the way that we would invoke a constructor function, a function that's literally made to create other objects, is by using the new keyword. And that brings us to the fourth important rule of this. It's the new binding rule. So every time you're trying to use a constructor function, like the one that I just wrote, you invoke that function using the new keyword. And when you invoke a function using the new keyword, it automatically creates an object for you. And the this inside of that function is going to refer to that newly created object. So if I did something like let Jane equals new instructor, and then I pass the properties. What's my hobby? Salsa dancing? I don't know. So now this refers to this newly created object. If I were to do another one, like let Graham what do we think his hobby is? Pokemon? Sure. Using the new keyword makes it so that the this with these properties refer to that particular object. And there's a couple different ways to do this with object-oriented JavaScript. For people that really like the class syntax, you can actually do class. And Nikki will get into this later today, but just so that it's not completely surprising. Yeah, that's the only difference. And these are the same thing. So using a constructor object or constructor function creates a new object for you. So now we've been over the 4 rules. Any questions so far?
Could you just go back to the preview where you have it?
Oh, there's a 3 here. Whoops. I'll let you catch up on your notes.
Why doesn't arrow functions work?
We're going into that next. All right.
Oh yeah, right.
All right. So far we've only been using regular old functions, using the function keyword. I like to think of the this inside of regular functions as a migratory bird because it travels from one object to another. Like we've seen that we can steal a method out of one object and give it to another object and have it refer to that other object. So like this is like a migratory bird that travels. But with arrow functions, great evil lurks. It doesn't act the same way. With arrow functions, they're kind of like turtles that have their own shell, and they carry their this context where they were defined. So it's no longer about where the function is executed, it's about where it was defined. So if we were to take this function and turn it into an evil arrow function, things would break. So now, say we're giving this object this arrow function. What would happen when I invoke object.arrowThis? Does anyone have any ideas? Let's go back and talk about what happened when we invoked whothis. This function right here on this object. So if I call object.whothis, what happens? What should I see?
The object.
All right. Yeah, I know. All right, I see the object. So I've executed the function. And when I executed it, it determined, that this context refers to the object. But what about with an arrow function? It looks innocent enough, and it looks pretty similar. But what happens when I invoke this? Should I also see the object, or should I see something else?
Undefined.
I see the window. Why?
Because, sorry, can you go back to the code?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's referring back to where it was defined, and where it was defined in const arrow.
Mm-hmm.
It's returning.
Exactly. So arrow functions kind of yield to whatever this is when they're defined. So out here, this is just the global object. And it kind of sticks to that this. There's kind of like its own binding going on. It carries it with it. All right. Yes?
So like, can we avoid? I guess my question is like, should we always use arrow functions over regular functions, or is there times when we should use regular functions over arrow functions?
So if you're inside of an object, do not use arrow functions to define a property. If you're inside an object, that's when things will break. I actually saw a good article called When Not to Use Arrow Functions. I can Slack it out later and it can answer some of these questions. But this thing that happens here, how it kind of implicitly binds to whatever this was when the arrow function is defined, it's not all evil, even if I make it seem evil. There will be situations in like mod 4 in React when you do actually want to rely on that behavior, but in this situation, in this object, we don't want to do this because it loses what the this should be. My question for you guys, does this make things any better? So say this isn't out here anymore. Does this help? I'm defining arrow this as an arrow function inside of the object now. Does that help us? Who says yes? Kat, what do you say?
I say it'll make the object.
This is what I thought for many eras. And this is confusing AF. Alright, so why? Why? We're inside of this object, right? But unfortunately, this object, the fact that it's an object doesn't create its own scope. Only a function can create its own scope. So this object is still kind of like hanging out in the global scope. So it doesn't give us its own this. What we could do, if we really wanted to, is we could make a function here using the function keyword. And now this function, and let me format this a little bit so it looks better. This function is enough to actually create its own scope. Inside of this function, if I were to invoke object.arrowThis, what should this be? So, I have this plan. I'm going to invoke object.arrowThis. As you can see, it's a function inside of a function. In order to get to this, I would have to invoke it twice, but right now I'm only focusing on invoking it once to get to this. So if I have a function on a property, arrowThis, and it's used with just the regular function keyword, what should the this be inside of that function? Hugo? Any other ideas? The object? Okay. Let's find out. So it's the object. So this is back to our rule number 2, implicit binding. All I'm doing is I'm invoking a function on an object. And it's a function that uses the function keyword. So it's back to the behavior that we discussed. This is the object. Now I'm returning an arrow function. So now, in order to get to the inner part, we're going to have to invoke it twice. What do you think this will give us?
The window.
You think the window. Okay. Anything else? And let me remind you, arrow functions are like turtles that carry their this with them. Whatever the this was, where they were defined, they yield to that this.
Oh.
So what was the this, where this function is defined? It's the object.
Yeah.
So now, does that change your answer?
Is it the same way for callbacks?
Can you clarify your question?
Like when you like pass in a for each or a map and then you reference this, is it like?
I don't know. Is it, Nikki? I can't even think of examples where I've done that.
My guess is when you pass in a callback, it would revert to global, because every time that gets executed, the callback gets executed, it's not executed on object dot something.
Yeah, that would make sense.
It's nothing before the dot.
That would make sense. So
even for arrow functions.
All right. So we've reached this territory where we're now like making functions inside of functions, and I just want to let you know that this is not really something that you'll see and that you'll be dealing with. So if this is too much, it's okay. This is just to show you like, hey, cool, you can do this cool thing. And like this is what happens in order for you to like get a deeper understanding. But just rely on the 4 rules. So I do want to explore some other things, because right now we've seen what it's like to have a function with the function keyword on the outside and an arrow function on the inside. What if we do a combination, all the different combinations of this? Like what if we did, okay, well, let's try all of them. Okay, so we've done this one. This is just for fun. This is extra credit. I will give candy for this. All right, so we've tried function and then arrow. What if we do arrow that returns an arrow? What should this give us? Everyone says global?
Yes.
All right. It's an easy one. Why is it global?
50-50.
Steven! That's not candy worthy. Sarah.
Because this is defined globally and the arrow function is being defined in the same scope.
Exactly. So this function, what's the this of this outer function? Exactly. And the inner function just relies on whatever the this was in the outer function. And here it was global, so here it's still global. All right. What if we put function here? What do you think will happen? Any guesses?
Well,
Also global. Who can explain why?
the arrow function was in the global scope. It is defined inside of it.
Exactly. All right. What if both of them are function? Will that change anything? I think this one is very interesting. What do you think that this is inside of this function?
The object.
Inside of the outer function. Kat?
Inside of the outer function, it would be the object.
Mm-hmm. And inside the inner function?
It would be the function.
The first one's going to be the object, the second one is going to be, it
Yeah.
should be the object again. For some reason, I think it will be.
Oh, this is not what I want. All right, so we invoke it once.
That's the object.
It's the object. We invoke it twice. It's back to global. This. Why? Because in the first function here, you're invoking it on a particular object, right? Rule 2. So always back to the rules. You're doing object dot method. But the inner function is not considered to be invoked on a particular method anymore. And when you're not invoking it on a method, you're just invoking it freely, is back to rule 1, default binding rule. Fun times in JavaScript. So yeah, that was just fun extra stuff. Always just go back to the rules, go back to the basics. You might be thinking, I get myself in Ruby, but I don't know what this is. Just go back to the rules. Or console log this. If you console log this and you see it's not what you expect, then you kind of like try to figure out, oh, what rule am I doing here? And most of the time, you'll be okay. And for arrow functions, do not use them inside of objects. So now let's go back to this. We answered Dan Abramoff's question. we don't need to get back into that again. Now, do we understand when this gets set? When does the this get determined of a particular function? When it's executed, right? For what type of functions? For arrow or for regular functions? For regular functions, it's determined when it's executed. What about for arrow functions? When does the this get set? Exactly. It's a turtle. It carries its this with it. Regular functions, the this is a migratory bird. It migrates to wherever you're using it. All right. What are the 4 rules for determining what the this should be? Can anyone tell me one of them? Ruby?
Default binding rule,
Okay, so what is that?
the one where it's when it's invoked freely, it's window the global
Great.
project.
Very nice. Candy? Who can tell me? That was cool. Who can tell me another rule? Jackie, you know these things.
Implicit binding rule.
All right, what does that one do?
So when you call this on a particular object, then it's the object.
Then it's the object, exactly. There's 2 more rules. Who knows? Sarah?
So explicit binding,
Mhm.
when you use bind call apply, you're setting it as the first argument.
Exactly. So you're telling your function what you want this to be. And the last rule? Someone else? Jordan, do you know?
The read binding rule,
All right, and what is that one?
within a constructor function, we call the new keyword, and then this refers to the newly created object.
Nice. And sorry. All right, and that concludes this for now.
Does it?
For now. That's enough this for now. All right, guys. Thank you, everyone.